Hi guys! Okay, so today we are going to talk about how to write an analytical essay. And before we get started, I do want to warn you that this is a sizable PowerPoint. But the reason for that is because an analytical essay is a little difficult to kind of wrap your head around, especially if you've never done one of these before. So I kind of talk you through how to analyze something in general before we actually apply it to analyzing a paper or something like that. Okay, so basically, when you analyze something, you're looking beneath the surface of it. So instead of taking something for just face value or accepting it for what it is, you're looking beneath the surface a little bit. So if you've ever watched a movie the first time you watch it, you are looking for just the main idea, what's going to happen. You're just looking for like plot stuff. But the second time you watch a movie, or the more that you watch the same movie, a lot of the times you end up seeing inconsistencies, or you recognize things that you may not have the first time that you watched it. So if you ever watched Shawshank Redemption, the first time through, you had no idea that ending was going to happen. But then the second time, or the third time, or the 90th time you watch it, because it's my favorite movie, the 90th time you watch it, the end starts to make more sense because you can see all of the things that lead up to it and how it all ties together because you know what happens. The Sixth Sense is a really old movie, but it has the same kind of a thing that because you know the ending, then the rest of the movie starts to make a little bit more sense and you put the puzzle pieces together. Sometimes when you watch certain movies, if you watch them long enough, or if you watch them enough times, you could actually see mistakes, like where you know that there were two scenes and they videotaped them twice and then cut them together because you see camera mistakes or script mistakes or things like that. I watch the show Law & Order SVU all the time. I'm addicted to it. I love it. And if anyone else watches that show, some of the people who are there now as detectives were once victims of crimes. One of the DAs, the district attorneys that they've used on the show, was actually convicted of a crime previously in different seasons. So that's kind of what analyzing is. So the easiest way to think of analyzing is if you apply it to behavior. So if you've ever been out on a date with somebody, or even been out with your friends, and then come home and you're waiting for them to call you or follow up or ask you out again or whatever, and you start to dissect how the night went. So if you were on a date, you're like, I thought things went well, and we had really good chemistry, and we laughed a lot, we had a lot of things in common, and he or she said they would do X, Y, and Z, and I don't know why they're calling, and maybe it's because they have a girlfriend or a boyfriend I don't know about, or maybe it's because this happened. So, and especially women, we do this all the time. But when you start thinking of all of these different situations for why something might be that way, that's analyzing. Your guesses don't necessarily have to be right, but if you could take your guess and then justify it with something. So if you were on that date, for instance, if you have a guess about something and you can justify it based on something that was said during the date or something that happened during the date, that's analyzing. So this is the slide about analyzing behavior. Usually what we do is we kind of settle on the thing that seems the most probable of happening. So if the person said they were going to call but they didn't call, we start thinking of all these reasons why maybe they didn't call. Well, they did say that they were really busy, so maybe they got too busy. Maybe they lost my phone number. Maybe their phone died. Maybe they dropped their phone in water and it's sitting in rice right now and they can't get to me. Maybe they're in the hospital. Maybe they got in a car accident. Maybe they were abducted by aliens. And we figure the alien thing probably didn't happen. So we kind of settle on the thing that makes the most sense. Like maybe they're just too busy. And usually women will never settle on the maybe he or she just didn't like me. Though sometimes we should. But anyway, I digress. So those are the things. That's analyzing. And sometimes we never figure out if we're right or we're wrong. And with analyzing, it's not being about right or wrong. It's just whether you could actually... It's not about being right or wrong. It's just whether you could actually take your opinion or your guess, I should say, not your opinion, but you could take your guess and justify it somehow. That's analyzing. Okay, so when we do this with an essay, what the hell does that mean? So with an essay, it can be a little scary, but again, pretend it's like we're watching that movie. When you're doing this academically, it's not going to be as entertaining as watching that movie. I'm sorry. So in my hygiene class, rather than you all picking an essay for you guys to, or an article for you guys to analyze, I'm giving you a choice between two articles to analyze, and you just have to pick one or the other. So this way, you don't have to find your own article and then analyze it. Because then I'd have to read whatever article you picked, plus read your analysis of it. Even though all of you in the class might pick the same exact article, or even if you are doing this on your own for some reason and you ever have to analyze something, everybody's analysis would be different because everybody is going to have a different feeling about certain parts of this essay. You guys are going to have different reactions towards different parts of different essays. So just because you have the same thing in front of you doesn't mean all of your final products will end up identical. Okay, so these are the steps that you need to do before you can do anything. If you have to find your own article, I strongly suggest printing it out first. So I've done this for you already. And then you need to read the article just to get an idea of what it's about. Just like when we watch the movie for the first time, we just get an idea of what the movie is about. But the next two steps are the most important. You need to read this article at least one more time. So you really should read an article 2 or 3 times, because the second and third time, just like when you watch that movie the second time, you pick up more information, and the third time you pick up more information, it's the same thing with the article. The more you read it, the more you start to look at it closer and closer and closer, and little things that you didn't notice the previous time pop out to you. And the reason that I suggest printing this out is because you're going to need to take notes right on the article, because that's how you're actually going to brainstorm for this paper. So we have 5 areas that have to be analyzed, and when you write an analytical essay, they don't have to show up in this order, but all 5 of these do need to be in the paper. So if you prefer to start with purpose and then go on to audience and then content and author and then timeliness, go for it. Like I said, it does not matter that you do these in the order that they are on this slide. All 5 of them just have to be represented. And I'm going to go through each of the 5 areas. The hardest thing with this paper is organization. It really is, because if you don't know where some information falls, like if you're reading your article and you don't know which of these 5 areas it's going to fall into, and if you don't use an outline, these 5 sections are going to start to kind of intertwine and collapse on each other. But we're going to talk about that. So for each of the 5 sections, what we're going to do is I'm going to give you some questions that you want to kind of ask yourself. And the answers to those questions should help you start to form your analysis. But the answers to your questions need to be justified or supported with an example from the article. So if you look at the 3rd bullet point here, I hope you can see my mouse. You want your opinion plus an example. That's what equals analysis. But you have to do this all in 3rd person. So you get to use your opinion, but you have to support it somehow. If you're physically in class, the exercise that we started class with for dental hygiene students, we would have done this during that exercise about Frankenstein. If you're doing this at home or on your own and didn't have me in class in front of you, then we can kind of do a one-on-one if you need, as far as examples go, or as far as that story goes. Okay, so when you read this article, there are going to be certain things that are going to irritate you or aggravate you, and they have to be actually about the article. It can't just be that you have to read it at all. But there's going to be things about it that you like and things about it that you don't like. You're going to use all of that, because all of those things that you're feeling when you're reading this article, those can all be used in the essay as long as you could use an example from the article to justify why it's irritating or annoying or repetitive or not necessary. So your main goal of these 5 sections, what you're going to do, your goal is to decide and determine whether the article overall is reliable, whether it's trustworthy, whether it's credible. All of those things mean the same thing. So when you finish the author paragraph, at the end of that paragraph, you're going to determine whether the information that you've provided about the author makes the author reliable or not to write that paper or to write the article that you're reading. If you're going to determine at the end of the timeliness paragraph, you're going to determine if the timeliness of the sources that were used add to or take away from the article's credibility. So for each of these 5 sections, you're going to determine at the end of each paragraph, or when you finish each section, whether it adds to or takes away from the overall article's credibility. When you get down to the end of the paper, that's where you're going to make your determination of overall as a whole, whether the paper is credible or not. So if you said, the author's really credible, the audience is credible, timeliness not so much, purpose is a little iffy, but the content's reliable, then overall maybe you decide the content and the article itself is reliable, meaning it's something you would trust to use in one of your papers so that you don't have fact errors if you cited it, for example. So that's all I did was talk about this bottom bullet point here. Okay, so as far as author, this is the first one on my list. Doesn't necessarily need to be the first one on your list. But when we analyze author, we want to consider all of these things about the person who wrote it. So even though I am a doctor, if I am writing a medical article, are you trusting me based on my credentials? Well, you might because I'm a doctor, but you also might not because I'm not the right kind of doctor to be writing medical stuff. I'm not a medical doctor. So you could say, well, yeah, this author, Dr. McDonald, is very reliable because she is a doctor, so she knows how to do her own research. However, she's not a medical doctor, so that takes away from her credibility to write about something medical. Sometimes, for certain topics, gender might play a role. So if a man is writing a paper on breast augmentation, sorry, one of my students just wrote about that, so that's why it popped in my head. But if a male student is writing about that, a female reader might look at it and not trust it as much because a guy wrote it. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're right or wrong, but that might be the feeling that they have about it, because sometimes women want to trust women on those kinds of issues. Age could play a role as well. So you might trust a teacher who is my age more so than someone who's in their 70s maybe, because since I'm younger, you might assume that I graduated from school more recently, so I'm more up to date on the more recent technologies or strategies and things like that than someone who's way older than I am. So age can play a role. A teacher who's been teaching for 30 years, you might trust them more than me. At this point, I've been teaching for 7 years. However, you might not care. It might not matter to you. So that's why some of these things you need to kind of think about. Usually with an article, at the very end of the article, either before the references or after the references, typically after the references, there's a paragraph that gives you some information about the author. So that's how you can find out some of this stuff. Another thing, has the author published anything before? Usually if they've published, sorry, I'm like sliding off my chair. Usually if they've published a bunch of articles, then they're known within the field, so other people trust them to publish them. The reason that I have political ties, sexual affiliation, and religious affiliation in here is because that sometimes if people are a certain sexuality, if they're a certain political stance, if they're a certain religious stance, then it might add bias to what they write about because that's how they feel about things. So for example, someone who politically is a Republican is usually pro-life, so they're completely against abortion. So if the author is, writing about single-parent homes or something like that, they might use research that helps support their pro-life stance because they're a Republican, whereas the tone of the article might be a little bit different if they were Democrat. I don't know. I just kind of pulled that all out of the air. But whatever your opinion is, whether you care about gender, whether you don't, whether it super matters or whether it doesn't, as long as you can take that information and then use an example from the article, that's an analysis. Like I gave you with the example of my credentials. Okay, so when we talk about audience, we already know from English 1 that audience is the people who read this. So you are writing for a general audience, but it doesn't mean the person who wrote the article is writing for a general audience. So you need to figure out, based on the language that the author used, based on the setup and design of the article, based on the way it looks, based on punctuation, whether they used slang, whether they used jargon, you need to figure out who you think the intended audience or audiences might be. And you need to use examples from the article. So, and again, it's in third person. So instead of saying, I think the audience is, you would say something to the effect of, one possible audience that this article targets would be other people in the education field, because of the language that is used. For example, in the 5th paragraph of the article, the author uses the words, I'm drawing a blank, syllabus, anticipatory set, grading scales, sliding scales, and lesson plans. These terms are typically ones that other teachers use, so this might be geared towards other teachers. In addition to other teachers, another audience for this article might be the general public, because not only does the author use those terms in paragraph 5, but he or she also explains them so anybody can understand it. That's kind of what we're talking about here. Now, the thing is that if you read this article and you don't understand it, in no way does it mean that you're stupid at all. If you read this and you can't understand it, or you can't understand parts of it, what it means is that you right now, in your current position in life, either as a beginning student, as someone in their 20s, someone in their teens, someone in their 40s, wherever you're at right now in your life, in your education, in your career, you're not the intended audience. That's all it means. In no way does it mean that you're stupid. So when you're reading it, if you feel stupid, if you don't understand it, if you feel frustrated reading it, use it. And then use examples of where you felt frustrated and how it could make someone in the general audience feel frustrated. Or how you know the general audience is not the audience because of where you felt frustrated. Okay, analyzing purpose. There's a slight problem on this slide. This stuff over here about thesis statement is supposed to be in content. So, while we're here, I'm going to just alter this a little bit. Oh, I knew that was going to do that to me. Please hold. You really have no choice, so just hang on a second. Talk amongst yourselves. Enjoy the break. I would hit pause and then pick up with the recording, but it's not as easy as you would think it would be. We're going to get to this in a little bit, obviously. Okay, so let me go back now. We did audience. Let's talk purpose. Purpose is the part of this paper that gets screwed up the most and gets screwed up the easiest. So if you have this written down in front of you, or if you're taking notes, maybe instead of writing purpose, you might want to write the word motivation as I take a drink. So when you're analyzing purpose, what you're doing is trying to figure out, why did this author sit down, do the research, and actually write this article at all? Did they do it to sell their product? Maybe they work for the company and it's part of their job. But if publishing this article leads to more sales, they might get a bonus. Are they doing it for school? So if you read the author bio at the bottom and you see that the student or the person who wrote it is still a student, well, maybe they needed to write the article for a grade or to be able to graduate, or maybe it was an opportunity that they had while they were in school. So when I had to write my dissertation, all 288 pages of this thing, 278, something like that, basically, but it is a book. Trust me, I did not want to write and edit and rewrite almost 300 pages. But I had to do it because I needed it to graduate. I needed it to become a doctor. If I didn't do it, I never would have become a doctor. So my motivation to sit down and write that book was to graduate. But then me taking that almost 300 pages and chopping it down and making it smaller and publishing pieces of it in different articles, my motivation for doing that is to educate other people who aren't going to read the 300-page book. It's to reach a wider audience. One of the journals pays me for every article that I publish, so I like that journal, but I don't get any other money for it. But what I also get is really good exposure. So other people in the industry are going to read what I write and see the research that I do and see my name. And it could create opportunities for me down the road. That's what you're trying to think of here. So you're going to look at that author, look at what the article's about, look at the blurb of information that you have about the author, and try and figure out potential reasons why they sat down and actually took the time to do an article. Now, having been published in a few journals, I can tell you that these articles do typically take a couple months to put together, and they go through several rounds of edits and can get rejected. So it's not, I used to think it was you just write something and send it in and they publish it. For a lot of the journals, you also have to pitch, as an author, you have to pitch your idea first to the editor, and then the editor decides if their audience would actually want to read it. So sometimes there's some negotiation that goes on. So publishing an article isn't just like sitting down and writing an informative essay or something like that. There's a lot more that goes into it. So would someone really do all of that work just because just out of the goodness of their heart? Usually no. Usually there's more to it than that. So that's what you need to figure out as far as purpose goes. And again, purpose is the one that usually gets messed up quite a bit. So be careful with that one. Okay, for timeliness. For this one, what you're doing is you're looking at the article's sources. And you want to see if the sources that the author used actually help or hurt a paper. When we talk about reliable research, we want the sources that are used in an article to be within 5 years of when the article was published. So if the article was published in 2012, that means it was probably written couple months earlier, like I said. So for example, I wrote an article and I finished an article in September of 2017, but it didn't actually get published until January of 18. So some of my sources would have been within the 5-year time frame from when I wrote it in 2017, but when it got published in 2018, it might have been 5 years and a couple months old. But anyway, look at the date the article was published. Then look at the dates of the sources in the reference list. So if an article was published in 2012, but the sources are from the statistics, the data that's used, the important facts that can change, if the source was from 1982, then technically the information in the article is 30 years old. So a lot of things could have changed in 30 years. Sometimes, though, someone might write an article. So if I wrote an article about education, the definition of education, this is a loaded statement. The definition of education hasn't changed over the years. So maybe I use an older source to define education. So, okay. Or as a dental hygienist, if you needed to define gingivitis or cavity or something like that, the definition hasn't changed. So you could use an older source for that. But the techniques to treat gingivitis, the techniques for educating students, the different kinds of students, those have changed over time. Statistics about how many people develop gingivitis or cavities, statistics about how racially diverse education is, or how many students speak different languages, or how many students are attending college. Those numbers change constantly. So you want the absolute most current, most recent, newest sources you can find. As a writer, the more recent your sources are, the stronger and stronger your reliability is, and stronger the content of the article is. So that's what you're looking at here with timeliness. Did the author use sources that are super, super old? Did the author use themselves as a source, which I've seen, which I think is really sad, to be honest, but you may have a different feeling about it. And the other thing is, if the source is old, is that okay? Or could the information have changed? So could the dates of the sources that were used somehow affect the article that was written? That's what you're looking at. Okay, content. So this was the slide I was just playing around with and made 2 slides. So as far as content goes, you're looking at a bunch of different things. One thing you can look at is what the style of the paper is, and this could be more than one. So maybe an article starts off informative, and then it takes a quick detour into persuasive because they're trying to get you to buy a product, which happens a lot with some of these articles. Was there anything that you felt was missing, was that needed to be explained better? Was there information in there that was completely useless? So as you're reading it, you're like, why is this here? Why am I reading this? This has nothing to do with the topic. I don't care about this. Literally everything that you're thinking and that you're saying to this article, jot down everywhere, because that's what you're going to use when you start to glue this paper together. At any point, did the article go off topic and you got lost? Did you feel like it was disorganized? Did you feel like you couldn't follow it, like there was no flow to it? All of that stuff is content. And again, remember, when I say did you feel, you're going to write your answer in third person, and then you need to take an example from the article to justify it. So usually when you write a first draft of this, the comment that I make the most is, show me. Give me an example from the article. Give me an example. I say it. That's the biggest comment I make in the first round of edits for this kind of a paper. So now, the other slide that still has to do with content that I moved is about the thesis statement. So you all know what a thesis statement is, especially if you've had me in class before. If you haven't, and you're in this class but you weren't in English 1, then I'm supposed to assume you know what a thesis statement is. If you are on my YouTube channel and you are watching this and you don't know what a thesis statement is, stop now or wait until this is over, and then go watch the video about introductions because I talk about thesis statements at the last half of that video, and it'll explain it for you. But anyway, when you're looking at this article, you know what a thesis statement is, where it should go, and how long it should be, and how it should be formed. So Does the article have one? Can you find it? Is it in the right spot? And was it written the right way? If you can't find a thesis statement, or to all of those questions I just said, you know, like if you answered no, or if you can't find the thesis, the issue is not you, the issue is the writer. If you can't decide whether this sentence is the thesis or this sentence is the thesis, the issue is not you, the issue is the author. And that's what you talk about. Because as a writer, you know where a thesis statement goes, how it's written, how long it is, and its structure. So if you can't figure out where the thesis is, that's an issue. And you also know the job of a thesis statement. So if you can't find one, or you can't figure out what it is, that's an issue. So if I didn't say this enough, please go with your feelings. You can talk about way more stuff than I brought up. The questions that were in the previous slides were just kind of to get your thoughts flowing a little bit, just to get you started. But of course you can talk about other things. The whole paper is going to feel like your opinion, which might make you happy. But again, it's got to be in third person, and every single opinion that you give has to have an example from the article. So some students start a draft of this in first person just to get all their ideas out, and then before they show it to me, they go back through and they take out all the first person and they put it in third person. And then that's how they end up in third person. Some people, especially those who have had my class before, you can jump right into third person because I've started beating it into your head long ago. If you have no idea what I'm talking about when I say first person and third person, when you're done with this video, if you're on my YouTube channel, go to the video that's called Person and watch that. Okay, so we didn't even write your essay yet. All we did was brainstorm. That's why this PowerPoint is so long. So I mentioned that every idea, every opinion you have needs to have at least one example. You can use the same example from the article to support different points at different spots in the essay. That's completely fine. The other thing is that you'll probably notice as you're writing that one of your 5 sections, so just to kind of remind you a little bit, these are your 5 sections. One of these will probably, one of them, 2 of them, 3 of them will probably end up way bigger than another area might be. So usually people don't spend, I mean, you might not spend a lot of time on timeliness and you might not spend a lot of time on author, but holy moly, you spend an entire page and a half on purpose. I don't know. It doesn't matter how much 1 paragraph, 3 paragraphs, 8 paragraphs, it doesn't matter how much you talk about author, how much you talk about audience. They all don't have to be the same size or the same length. They just all have to be represented. So if you run into a situation where you don't have a lot to say about audience, but you have tons to say about content, that's fine because they're both in the paper. All right, so I'm just going to go back to that slide where I was at. So that's what this bullet point was talking about, that you might end up with more to say about one section than you do in one of the others, but that's okay. All 5 don't have to be the same size. So there's 2 different ways that you can do an introduction for an analytical essay. So you can do an inverted pyramid about the article itself. Now, when you do this, I should have recorded myself far earlier because I am catching all these mistakes in my PowerPoint here. when you write this paper, anytime you write an analytical article, it is super, 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 super important that you put the author and the title of the article in the introduction. The reason you're going to do that is because then you won't have to worry about doing any citations through the rest of the paper. Now, this is for if you're in my dental hygiene class. Those are the instructions that you're following. If you're in another class and you have another instructor, they might still require formal internal citations. But for my dental hygiene students who have me in class, who are listening to this, and who have gotten my syllabus, I'm telling you, the author has to go in the intro, and the title of the article has to go in the intro, and then for the rest of the paper, you can just say according to page 2 of the article, or according to paragraph 10 of the article for your samples, for your examples. You won't have to use formal citations, and you don't have to give me a formal reference page or anything like that. So one of the 2 ways that you can do an introduction is inverted pyramid about the article itself. So I completely made this up. I do not know if I'm sure a Jane Smith exists somewhere, but I have no idea if the Dogs Are Human article exists. I completely made that up. So here is the inverted pyramid about the article topic. So just about dogs, and then I lead into the article. Dogs can be considerably thoughtful companions to many. In many instances, they are thought of as a member of the family. Jane Smith's article, Dogs Are Human, examines the similarities between these animals and their masters. While Smith's use of examples strengthen her argument, her disorganized storytelling detracts from the essay. So my thesis statement is in red. So notice how I talk about something good, something bad. And a lot of the times for an analytical essay, you honestly cannot write your thesis statement until the end, because you might not be sure where you land on credibility of those 5 sections until after you've kind of worked through those sections. So that's okay. You can try a narrative introduction for this as well if you're one of my kids who, or a student who works well with narrative introductions. You could try it. The other way to do it is to just introduce the article itself right off the bat. Notice that the same exact thesis statement is at the bottom of this. So again, I made all this stuff up. In Jane Smith's article, Dogs Are Human, she explores the similarities between these faithful companions and their owners. Oftentimes, she discusses, dogs and owners can grow to resemble each other, have the same temperament, and even develop their own language. While Smith's use of examples strengthen her argument, her disorganized storytelling detracts from the essay. So in this one, first I talked about dogs, and then I eventually got to the article itself. Here I just started talking about the article right from the beginning, and gave kind of a quick overall gist of what she talks about, and then went into the thesis statement. So those are 2 choices. Again, you can try the narrative. I usually don't have people do a narrative intro for this paper because they just find one of these 2 a little easier, but go for it. I'd love it. Try it. The thesis statement can take a couple different shapes, but the one that I had in the previous intro examples is pretty much the pattern. So if you're one of my students, you're more than welcome to take this pattern and just fill in the different last name, something that strengthens the essay, and then something that takes away from it. So you can kind of use my words if you want. I'm letting you do that. It's not plagiarism because I'm giving you permission. The reason that this is a little bit different than an informative or a persuasive thesis statement is because it's kind of giving you what's credible what's strong, what's trustworthy about the article, and then kind of what isn't. So it gives you both of those. But that doesn't make it a compare-contrast, because we're not talking about two different things. We're only talking about one article. Okay, so there are places where this article can go wrong, and I would rather tell you what they are up front rather than it blowing up in your face and you wondering why I didn't tell you right from the beginning. One big issue with this is to end up summarizing the entire article and recapping what happened rather than, oh, I didn't even look at the PowerPoint and I realized I used the same word. Sorry. At least you know I wrote this. But you don't want to spend your paper retelling me what they talked about in their article. That's a summary. What you want to do is rip it apart. Rip it to shreds. Dissect it. And as your reader, I figure out what the article was about based on all the use of all of the examples that you put throughout the paper. So that's how I, as your reader, and not actually the reader of the article that you're analyzing, that's how I figure out what the article was about, because of how many examples you use and how you use them constantly throughout the paper. I mentioned this at the beginning, that organization is a big issue with this paper, because a lot of the times you can have one section kind of bleed into another. So what a lot of students do is they will open 5 different Word documents and just write about purpose in one Word document and just write about author in another one. And it almost helps keep them focused a little bit, and then they glue it all together. Rather than trying to talk about one thing, this is definitely a paper that you cannot just open a Word document and crank out of your head. You need to have some kind of outline, some kind of plan before you go into the paper of what you want to talk about within each section and the examples that you're going to use within each section. Otherwise, as the paper goes on, you kind of, you, meaning anybody who does one of these papers, has a tendency to just kind of start rambling. So I had told you that the most common first comment that I make, my first read through one of these papers, is show me, give me an example. The second one is literally highlighting pieces of sentences or pieces of paragraphs and saying, this is purpose, this is audience, and then you as the writer kind of have to cut and paste and glue all those pieces together. So I might find 3 different pieces of paragraphs that are all timeliness, and now you got to put them all together because you got disorganized or you got sidetracked or something like that. So a lot of students find the separate Word documents a lot more helpful because it keeps them focused and on track. Okay, so I already talked about the not using an outline continued. Not using enough examples. So I hope I have drilled this into your head by now, and you're sick of hearing me say this. But if you give me a fact or an opinion and you don't justify it, you are not analyzing. So for every point that you make, you need at least one example. The more examples you give me, first of all, the longer the paper is going to be, and second of all, the stronger your analysis is going to be. Fact errors is also another issue. So if you read that the article was written in 2007, but the author was in school at the time, if you don't Google that person to see if they actually graduated and you just say they graduated in 2007, then that's a fact error because maybe they didn't graduate, or maybe they graduated in 2009. You don't know. So as I mentioned before, you're going to put the author and you're going to put the article title up in the introduction, because then later when you talk about your examples, you can just say on page 59, on page 3, in paragraph 12, So that's how you're going to kind of tell your reader where your example's coming from. You also need to kind of think of this as your tie to thesis. So at the end of every body paragraph, you are going to tell me whether it adds to or takes away from credibility. So that's my third, usually if I get a third read on these, that's a third bubble. Third most common bubble that I'm making is at the end of the paragraph I write, yeah, so does this make the author, does this make the article more credible or less credible? Because you need to keep putting a sentence in there, repeating yourself, explaining whether it increases or decreases credibility. We talked about the other stuff on this slide. So, if you are in my dental hygiene class, here are your essay requirements. This needs to be 2 full pages. Yeah, I'm getting to fix a lot while I'm doing this. All right. So I'm asking for 2 pages. Now, considering how long this lecture has been and how many sections you have to talk about, 2 pages is not difficult to hit, to be honest with you. Well, no, actually, you can guess about how long you think these papers usually end up to be. But if you cannot hit 2 pages, we have and you've talked about all 5 sections, we have a significant problem. So this is going to be double-spaced. It's in third person. This is going to be in 12-point font. And actually, this is going to, your only option is Times New Roman, because we're going to do this in APA style. As far as APA format goes, if you are in my class, I'm going to show you in class how to create the title page and how to format a document in Microsoft Word. If you are not with me in person, but you have access to my YouTube channel, you can actually, there's a video called Formatting an APA Paper in Microsoft Word. Use that video because I will take you through the same exact steps that I'm going to take the class through in person. Now, I skipped over this bullet point. You really don't have to do any outside research for this at all. The only time someone usually asks me if they could look up an outside source is for information on the author. If you choose to do that, and again, I really am stressing choose because you don't have to. The article itself gives you everything that you need. But if you choose to do any outside research, especially on the author, you don't have to give me formal citations because if you're in English 2 in my dental hygiene program, I have not taught you how to do that yet. And I am not going to take points off for something I didn't, or expect you to do something I didn't teach you yet. That's not fair. So at least for now, if you're going to look up something and you're going to use it in your paper, then I need you to do 2 things. You need to put it in your own words, and you need to start the sentence with, according to, and either give me the name of the website, or say, according to www.com, comma, the author graduated in 2009. That's enough for now. Now, if you have learned how to do citations and you decide that you want to put an internal citation and a reference page or works cited page at the end, you're welcome to. For my dental hygiene students, if you do it incorrectly, if you put the formal citation in there but you mess up the citation, I will not take points off because, again, I didn't teach you how to do it, so I don't think that that's fair. The reason that you're doing this essay is because in the English 2 course for dental hygiene, you're not necessarily going to use this paper again, but you need to know how to do this skill and how to analyze an article for when we get a couple assignments down the road. And if you are in the dental hygiene program at our school, you will have to find a scholarly article, which I'll teach you how to do later in this course, and analyze it for one of your later courses in the program. I believe it's your ethics course. So this will come back at you again, which is why I'm putting you through such terrible torture. I'm so sorry. Okay. Well, I hope this helped. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask, and I will see you soon. And thanks for bearing with my edits as we went through this. All right, I will see you later. Bye.